Steve, take it away.
Well, good morning. And if you don't see my lips moving, it's because the technology apparently doesn't want me um, to break the monitors of you guys at home. I have a face for radio, so this is probably what's going on. Um, yeah, the technology has been fascinating this year, and it's great when it works, and not so great, obviously, when it doesn't. So let's see. Now, maybe wait. This is There we go. You pushed the right
Hey!
button. Okay. That's a good thing I changed out of my pajamas this morning then, huh, Bob? Um, right. So 1991, so 2021, that's 30 years, Bob. And what's been really interesting about these last 30 years is that there have been so many amazing developments of various kinds. Um, Back when I first conceived of this show, there was no World Wide Web. There was no Hubble telescope. There was no Facebook. There was no Google. And you couldn't take the world around in your pocket with one of these smartphones. So much has changed, and there's been huge advances in technology. Um, and But along with our addiction to fossil fuels, yeah, we picked up an addiction to these things. Um, but that addiction to fossil fuels, also in these last 30 years, has meant that emissions are up 60%. Greenhouse gas emissions are up 60%. And the back of the envelope calculation, and those of you who are precise, hopefully you'll forgive me for rounding the numbers, but in 1760 or so, we had the greenhouse gas equivalent of about 275 parts per million of CO2 in the air, which is about 4/100ths of a percent of the atmosphere if you're quickly calculating. Today, if you combine the climate forcing gases, if you add to the CO2, you add methane and nitrous oxide from ag, and then there's some tiny ones like sulfur hexafluoride, and not so tiny ones, the HFCs that are used in refrigerants. The climate forcing concentration right now in the atmosphere is over 500 parts per million. 500 parts per million. And so what we've seen is since the industrial age, we've seen about a 1 degree centigrade rise, 1.1 to put a finer point on it. So that has led to what? More floods, stronger hurricanes, bigger tornado clusters, record drought, crazy floods. We're really feeling it from climate disruption already. And if we get to, let's say, over 2 degrees C, we're really looking at tough times for this planet. Maybe toasting, well, certainly civilization, the way we're used to it, is going to have a very hard time. And already we're dealing with the refugees, with the climate refugees that are having to move from one place to the next and all that. So all this, of course. But at the same time, today at the White House, there is this climate summit that President Biden has called, and some 40 leaders around the world, the big dogs, the Europeans, and of course the United States and China. Now, there's a good news that obviously we have resumed participation in the whole worldwide process of trying to address this. But the bad news is that the technique that we're using to deal with this is, well, it's not having the desired effect. If you look at the politics and the policies of today, there are a couple of basic principles that people are using. One is economics and markets, and that is, well, it's questionable, because if you, we've so increased wealth in this country and around the world, but we've only done it for the very top. Actually, the 1/10 of 1% have seen like this incredible rise. But most people have either stayed flat or things have gotten worse. And just as another back of the envelope calculation, our kids many of our kids can't afford to buy the houses that they grew up in. So we're kind of upside down with that as well. And of course, the other nostrum that we're told, and they'll be greatly discussed, I'm sure, at the White House today, is technology. The technology is going to save us. And that if we keep driving, we've got to get electric cars. We've got to go to renewable energy and such. And those things certainly help. I don't want to say that doesn't help. But the trouble is, we've tied all that up into our economy that we're telling people that, look, the climate emergency is a great opportunity to make a ton of money. There's trillions of dollars of new capital to be deployed and new technologies to be employed that's going to make everybody rich as we save the planet as we know it. Well, I just got to ask you, what's happened over these last 30 years that we've been working on the technology? Solar cells, and I have them at my house, thank heavens, but the price of them has really plummeted. And I think actually I'm talking to you from my home, I think the sun is bright enough that I'm actually using solar energy right now to power this setup that I'm talking to you from. But we haven't moved the needle. We're still seeing this 60% increase. Emissions, even with the virus, we saw obviously some drop in emissions because of the stopping to use as many vehicles as we were locked down. But for the most part, the charts say that we're going to continue to march upwards. And we're going to spend a fortune on technology that doesn't even really make that much sense, like carbon capture and storage as a reason to keep burning fossil fuels. You know what? We need carbon capture and storage to refreeze the Arctic, to quote George Woodwell. George is the fellow who started the Woods Hole Research Center. It's now called the Woodwell Climate Center. And some 32 years ago, I went to Woods Hole to visit with George because I was working on a project. I thought I'd write a book about climate disruption at the time. And George started giving me gray hair because he mentioned the biotic feedbacks of what was going on. And how it was affecting the Arctic. So as the planet was warming, George said, look, permafrost is going to release more methane and CO2. That in turn is going to make things warmer, which means that then the high Arctic will get warmer and release more methane and CO2, and you would start to get this vicious circle. You start to get this feedback loop that will be self-reinforcing. And at the time, the annual carbon flux was about 700 gigatons of carbon in the atmosphere in the winter and 600-ish in the summer because there are a lot fewer trees with leaves and everything in the southern hemisphere. So, and humans were on the scale of, I'm sorry, I'm not remembering exactly, but certainly less than 8 gigatons a year humans were adding. And so the oceans especially seem to be soaking all of that up. Well, at some point, as we warm things, we're going to overwhelm the ability of the natural environment to soak up our emissions. And in fact, we've been slowly eroding that as we see emissions keep going up. And the history here, the responsibility for those of us here at an American and a United States university is profound, because we have, by far, the United States has emitted the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, human released carbon in the atmosphere over the years. As of today, if we were to look at today's budget, China is ahead of us. But if we look back, we are like, 2 to 3x what any other country has done. So we have a great responsibility to get started in this. And we're not doing it yet. So one of the things that at Living on Earth we decided to explore was, what are some other things that might work if changing the economy is not having that effect yet, if turning to technology is still behind the curve, what else might we consider? Well, we're science journalists in part, and when you're a scientist and you're not getting results, you look to see, well, what else could be going on? And by the way, a lot of scientific discovery, as you know, is a function of accidents, right? I mean, you think of radiation being discovered because somebody leaves something on a film, or you think of antibiotics because somebody notices that the bread that they left, the bacteria, there are no bacteria around it. And so a story that we're telling right now is that of Lovelock and the Gaia hypothesis. And Gaia, who, by the way, was considered a bad student, he had to go to night school. Yay, we know about people who are older when they go to university, and that's exactly what James Lovelock did. He finally got into the University of Manchester, ultimately got his PhD in medical research, and was working on detection instruments when NASA gave him a call and said, hey, we want to find out if there's life on the nearby planets. And of course, so Venus is the closest one, right? It's 25 million miles away, and it is a hot mess. It's 470 degrees centigrade all the time. That's 900 degrees Fahrenheit, right? 880 or something. And its atmosphere is largely CO2, and there's a little bit of some drops of sulfur in it as well. Now, he was charged. The reason they approached him is that he had this interesting electron detector, and later on he'd use it actually to figure out what was going on with the ozone hole. But they figured that he could look at the atmosphere and see what would make for conditions of life. So obviously the Venus option wasn't so great. So then looking at Mars, the good thing about Mars is it's a little friendlier to Earth because its day is, it's searing hot and night is cold, kind of like our moon, but it has a thin atmosphere. In fact, the Perseverance just flew its helicopter the other day. But it too is loaded with carbon dioxide, and there's tiny bits of oxygen there. So he said, the question here is not, well, is there life elsewhere, but why is there life on Earth? And I will urge you, because we don't have a lot more time to talk about this today, but I'll urge you to look at the core of the Gaia hypothesis. Essentially, what he reasoned is that all three of our planets are constantly spewing out carbon dioxide from the volcanoes, but somehow the microbes and the water and the air and the energy had gotten together to create photosynthesis on this planet. And photosynthesis has been working for these billions of years to sequester the carbon, and we have this homeostasis really with this planet now, that we're constantly regulating the planet to stay in this kind of Goldilocks range of temperature and concentration of the gases. We're destabilizing that now. Photosynthesis has had to sequester so much carbon. 4 of the extinctions were caused by volcanoes, and they spewed out all that CO2 and knocked species down, and Mother Earth had to come back together again and sequester all that carbon, and of course it's buried, right, as coal and oil, and it's on the land, it's under the sea. And the one time that the asteroid hit and also caused a mass extinction, it's unlikely that stopped photosynthesis. So that's how the planet system works. But the thing that's intriguing about Gaia is that Gaia acts like it is alive, that it's a living organism because it's stabilizing itself. And I don't have time here to talk about it, but in fact, if you listen to the Living on Earth broadcast this weekend, or you go to our website, that's loe.org, when we post it, you'll find that Lovelock and the people who followed him, and by the way, Professor Lynn Margulis out at UMass Amherst, I should say the late Lynn Margulis, was really key in working with Lovelock. She was a genius as well. And her view of symbiotic evolution rather than a brutal form of evolution, that the neo-Darwin crowd tends to talk about, meant that all these species, all these systems could all cooperate. And to cut to the chase, the Gaia folks are saying now, we're not just looking at all the living things maybe coming together to become an organism on this planet, but the whole thing is that in fact the rocks and the air and the system are all involved in a way within this process. And that, we look at Aboriginal societies and the animism there, and we say, oh, well, the rocks don't think, the air doesn't feel, the water isn't alive. Well, but traditional societies say that. And now science is starting to say, well, where is the dividing line there about life? Because it all acts as an organism. The water seems to know. The clouds form have an albedo that reflects the sunlight to help reduce the amount of energy coming at us. Because in the last 4 billion years, the amount of energy coming from the sun has increased about 30%. So that means that if our planet hadn't figured out a way to reduce what we were taking in from the sun, that too would have turned us into, well, probably more like the desert that is Mars. Or maybe we would have had the runaway reaction on Venus. Either one, not great, but somehow we act like a living being to deal with this. And I'll just close on this thought about the living being. People are quick to say, well, Gaia, it's a pseudo-intellectual enterprise because anything that's alive reproduces. Well, let me submit to you that the simplest way to reproduce, if we think of a cell, we think of mitosis, it divides, right? That's the simplest reproduction process. We have on Mars right now the Perseverance. We have the device on Mars. One of the experiments is something called MOXIE, which takes the sun's energy and splits the CO2 into carbon monoxide, because if they take it all the way to the element of carbon, it'll just leave soot all over the machine, but it generates oxygen. And I heard, maybe it was even this morning, that the first time they turned it on, they got like 10 grams of oxygen, which would mean that you could, if we were humans and hooked up to it, we might breathe for, 10 or 15 minutes. But they're doing it. They're making it possible to create oxygen on Mars, which would mean that if there were to be a colony there, and by the way, right now our technology for rockets also requires oxygen for fuel, that we could get started there. So maybe, just maybe, Gaia is in the process of reproducing. This has been a long gestational period, but we're at the very early days of perhaps setting up a colony on Mars, which could then perhaps house many of the life forms that we have here on Earth. And so when that happens, and there's another planet in the universe that has life, Mother Earth truly will have been Mother Earth. She would have been the mother of another living system in the universe. So let's look to Gaia for some answers as to how we deal with the climate emergency. This is a lot deeper than a lot of us are willing to think.
Thank you so much, Steve, for some very thought-provoking things this morning on Earth Day, or maybe Mars tomorrow. Does anybody have a quick question they want to stick in the chat here that I really think it's interesting to think about? And Steve, you just touched on so many things that are going on in my mind and my work life currently, thinking about human rights and non-human rights. And when you connected the rocks with the people and the carbon cycle, absolutely true. Really, really interesting, but hadn't really thought about, the reproduction piece.
Yeah, she has, it's a long wave, for evolutions, millions of years are like, it's a different time scale.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, thank you again, Steve, so much for opening up a wonderful Earth Day Symposium, and looking forward to how we come out of COVID, but thinking about fixing other things as we do. And so thank you again for this morning's plenary.